All right, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time to connect React with Redux. There are quite a few steps to make this work, so we might even have to break this one into 2 screencasts. But what we're gonna do is simply start by building a React application, and then we're going to introduce Redux. We're gonna start with a good old-fashioned tried and true to-do app. So what I'm gonna do is create a new React app, and we'll call that React Redux To-Dos. Let's go give that a second to install. And what we want to think about here is how to build a small React application, as well as make sure that we integrate Redux with this. We're going to use Redux to store our to-dos, and we're going to use React to display those to-dos. And in order to do that, we can't just install Redux. We need to install another library to connect the two together. And that library is beautifully named React Redux. And just when you thought you were getting a grasp on Redux and things get more complex, unfortunately, we have to add a little bit more complexity to this. So inside of here, I'm going to install Redux and React-Redux. React-Redux is essential for connecting Redux and React. How do we use it? Well, it's a bit of a 2-step process. Before we worry about any React and Redux, why don't we start by building a very simple to-do application? But we're going to do this all in React. So we're going to start by simply, inside of our src folder, we're going to make a new file. We'll call that todolist.js. And we'll also make something called todo.js. So let's imagine there was no Redux in the mix. How would we build a very simple to-do list? Well, we'd start in our app.js by taking out a whole bunch of this stuff. Maybe inside of here, we'll say, see our to-dos. And all we're going to do here is render that to-do list component. So inside of this to-do list, we're not going to get very far if we don't import it. So we're going to import to-do list from /to-do list. Now we actually have to do some work in this to-do list component. So we're going to do the tried and true. We're going to import React as well as component from React. What else do we need to do here? Well, let's go actually make this component. How do we do that? Let's make a class. We'll call this to-do list. And we can export this as the default as well. And that is our to-do list, and it extends component. And what do we want to do inside of here? Well, we want some kind of constructor with some props. We'll call super on props if we ever want to pass anything down. And maybe we'll set some state. This .state is going to be an object, and it's going to contain some to-dos. Maybe those to-dos will be eat and sleep and go home. And what I'd like to do is render all of those to-dos. So inside of my render function, I'm going to return all of those to-dos. But I don't want to just return the text. I want to return a component that contains that text. So what I'll say is let my to-dos be this .state.to-dos, and I'll map over all of them. And I'll get the to-do and some kind of index. And you might know by now, it's not best to use an index for keys, but we're going to keep things really simple right now. What we're going to do is simply make a to-do component. But this to-do component is going to have some kind of task, which is going to be, and let's call this just a task. That's going to be the task and some kind of key of index. This is all we're going to do. And we don't even need to close this. We can make that self-closing. So we're going to pass those to-dos down there. But how do we do that? We got to import to-do from /to-do. We haven't made this component yet, but that's okay. We're going to return a div, and inside of this div, we'll place our to-dos. So let's go back to our to-do component. And remember, our to-do component is going to get some kind of prop of task. So how do we do that? Well, we could go back and import React and everything. But what do we really want to make here? We can just make a stateless functional component. So we'll say const to-do is going to be a function. And we could be even fancier and use an arrow function right here, because we can simply just return some value from this arrow function. And we are going to get some props. And we could be even fancier and destructure just the prop of task. So all we're really going to do here is actually, instead of making this a div, we're going to make this a div, and then inside we'll make an unordered list. And inside of this unordered list, we'll place our to-dos. Make sure that's a little bit cleaned up, and that looks better. Inside of my to-dos, I'm going to just make a list item. Simply going to be a list item with task right here. So let's go back and start this up with npm start. We should see this pop up in the browser. And if we've done everything correctly, we should see our to-dos. But we might have some bugs, who knows? Let's give this a second and see what it loads. Failed to compile. Export default was not found in /to-do. Let's go make sure that we're exporting that. It doesn't look like we are. Export default to-do. Got to make sure that we export those to-dos or we're not going to get very far. Cannot resolve React in React Redux to-dos src. Cannot resolve React. How do we get that problem? Cannot resolve React. Well, what happens when we run into that? And this happened because I actually forgot to npm install when I first loaded this application. So we already have React and React DOM. So I want to just make sure that I npm install. So let's give that a second. Make sure I install all my necessary dependencies and then start my application. Got a little too excited here building all those components. Have to make sure I actually run npm install. So we'll give that a second. And when we load that, we hopefully shouldn't see any more error messages. And there we go. We have eat, sleep, and go home. Now, there's not much styling here, and it's not very pretty. Trust me, I know that one. But it looks like we got some to-dos on the page. What I'd like to do is think about all of these to-dos as individual objects that are not stored in React, but actually stored in Redux. So what we're going to do is connect our Redux store to our React application. In order to do that, we actually need to make a Redux store. And in order to make a Redux store, we also need some kind of reducer. So we're going to go and make a couple files in this application. We're going to make a file, and we'll call that rootreducer.js. We'll also make another file where we can store all of our action creators. So we'll call this action creators.js. Now, ideally, you would have folders for these as you have more, but we're going to keep it really simple. What we're going to do inside of here is make a couple constants. We'll make one for add to do, and that's going to be called add to do, and we'll make one for remove to do. You might be wondering why we're doing this, and that's to make sure that we don't mess up with typos, and if things change, it becomes much easier. And we're going to export out a bunch of functions. We'll export out one for adding a to-do. We'll export a function called add to do. And here, this is going to return some kind of object with a type of add to do and some kind of task. We'll pass that in right here. It's going to have a key and a value of task. How about remove to do? Let's go export out a function called remove to do. It's going to have some kind of ID, and it's going to have a type of remove to do. So these are what our action creators look like. You might have not seen action creators in a little bit, but they're simply functions that return objects. That way we don't have to hard code the object that we're passing in. We simply just invoke one of these functions. And I shouldn't call this that. That looks a little bit better. My mistake. Where are we going to use these action creators? Well, we're going to use them when we connect React and Redux. But before we do any of that, we're going to need our root reducer. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a function. But before we make a function, we want some initial state. So we'll make some constant called initial state. And this is going to be pretty similar to what we had before. Some to-dos and some kind of ID. What we're also going to do is import all of our constants from action creators.js. Action creators. And what are we going to import? We can import add to do and remove to do. Because remember, these are simply the strings that we made before. What's nice about that is if these ever change, it works everywhere. It's still going to be add to do, it's still going to be remove to do. If you called this something like add another to do, it wouldn't make a difference. It would still apply here as well and in our reducer. So you might even see these action creators in another file. These are really just called types right now, or action types, the type of the action. We're doing this so that if this value ever changes, it's still going to be the same variable across our action creators and our reducer. So we brought in our action creators. What's it time to do now? Well, let's export a function. We export some function called root reducer. And this right here is going to accept two parameters, just like before, some kind of state, which is an initial state, and some kind of action. And inside of here, we're actually going to use a lot of the code that we used before. We're going to switch on the action type. And what are we going to do here? Well, if it is add to do, remember, we don't have to hard code that string or anything. We're bringing that all in from our constant in our action creators file. If that's the case, well, same thing as before. We can make some new state. And maybe you found a better way to refactor this. I encourage you to look at those. I just want to be really explicit right here. We'll grab whatever is in state. What do we then want to think about doing? Well, we want to make sure that we take that new state and we increment that ID by 1. Good, that looks pretty good. What else do we need to think about doing? Well, we want to make sure that we then return some kind of object. So we are going to return some specific object with a key of everything from state, as well as our to-dos. And these are going to be all of our state.todos, and then some kind of task, which is whatever the task of that action is, and the ID, which is new state.id. Let's keep this simple for now. It looks like there's a little bit of a syntax error that I have. Import add to do, remove to do equals action creator, so that's no good. I want that from action creators. That looks a little bit better. Silly syntax error there. Got to brush up on that syntax. So I made a simple function called root reducer. And while we're at it, we could actually add the same logic for removing a to-do. So in the event of remove to-do, what do we want to do here? Same thing. We'll say that our to-dos are going to be whatever we get filtered out by some value. We'll make sure that val.id is not the same as action.id. And here we should be able to pass in a number, so it should be a little bit easier. And when that's done, we're going to return a copy of state and our to-dos. In the event that none of these happen, we're going to simply return the state. So this is what our root reducer looks like. All we have is add to do and remove to do. And those are coming from these action creators that we've made. Add to do and remove to do. So we're exporting out those functions, and that's it. We have add to do and remove to do. So why don't we go save this and take a look in the browser. We can refresh the page and see what's going on. Now, you might see something wrong, and that's because we're not actually exporting out these constants. I want to make sure we do that as well. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far with importing those things too. So we make them, but we have to actually export them as well. Another silly mistake on my end. A lot of this you can kind of see by making your own mistakes. I've done this before a bunch, so I understand, but you may run into some problems, and that's okay. Find yourself just repeating this over and over again, and learn a lot by repeating it over and over. So what's next? We've made our action creators. We have these functions that return objects. That looks great. And then we have our to-do list, which looks good. Well, we have to connect React and Redux. And the bulk of that work is actually going to be done in our index.js. We are going to import the createstore function from Redux. Now, how come we're destructuring createstore? Because remember, the default export is Redux right here. And createstore is a function that lives on Redux. So we are going to just grab createstore from Redux. We also need our root reducer from /root reducer. This one is not destructured because in my root reducer, it's the default export right here. What else do we need? Well, that's actually it for now. We're going to make a store, and that is going to be the result of createstore with root reducer. And one more time, let's remember when we use the Redux DevTools, we want to go and grab that code that we saw before, Redux DevTools. Let's go to the second one. Let's scroll down a little bit, and let's make sure that everything is working right there. I'm going to grab this right here and make sure that we get that store. Once again, this is not code you're going to have to memorize. You're just going to find yourself copying and pasting this when you just get that initial setup. So I made the store, but how do I tell my React application about it? In order to do that, we are going to import an essential part of the React Redux library, React Redux. We are going to import something called provider. And we can see back here, just quick refresh, looks like we're all good there. The provider component is what we use from React Redux to connect our React application with our Redux store. And the way we do that is by wrapping our app with provider. So I'm going to make sure that I wrap the application with provider. And let's go save this. And you can see right here, I got this nice formatting. I'm going to pass to provider a prop called store. And what do you think we add in right here? Well, our Redux store right there. This right here is the glue between our React application and our Redux store. It's all done through this component called provider. And once we add this provider component, we allow any component that we make to get access to the Redux store. And that's a really important thing to understand. We previously saw that the only thing that could dispatch actions was the Redux store. But when we connect React and Redux, we'll actually see that any component that we want, when connected to the Redux store, will be able to dispatch actions on its own. And that's really cool because we're going to want our to-do list action because we're going to want certain React components to dispatch certain actions and to be connected to the Redux store. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to go back to my to-do list component. And here I don't want any state in React. That's it. I don't want any state on this specific component. But where am I going to get my state from? Well, now I'm going to get it from Redux. In order to connect a React component with the Redux store, the first thing we have to do is make sure that we have that provider component. And the second that we have that provider component, we can import a special function called connect. We're going to import connect from React Redux. I'm going to save that. And what we're going to do is instead of exporting the default right up here, we're going to export the default connect, which is going to return a function with our to-do list inside of here. I'm going to save this right here, and I'm simply going to put a debugger line right at this render. I'll save this code right here, and I'll refresh the page right over here. Cannot read property to-dos of null. Well, that's a bummer. Let's go save this. Let's go refresh the page. And before we get some errors, we actually see this debugger. And this is just because I want to show you what our component looks like. Our component has a property called props. And you might be wondering, well, what is this right here? Well, where does dispatch come from? Remember that Redux gives us the ability to dispatch actions. But previously, we only saw that the store was in charge of dispatching actions. We now, anytime that we connect a component to our Redux store, that component has the ability to dispatch actions of its own, which is pretty awesome. But we're going to see right now that we're using this.state.map and we're getting a bunch of errors. So I would like to get some state, but I don't want to get it from React. I want to get it from Redux. That's where the first parameter to connect comes in. What we're going to do quickly is review what we've seen, and then we'll go in the next screencast fix up this issue. To bring it all together, we started with a simple React app. We added some React state and showed some to-dos and made a stateless functional component for to-dos. We started adding a little bit of work for Redux by bringing in a reducer and bringing in the code that we saw from the previous screencast for creating a to-do. This is really not going to change that much. What we did make, though, is an action creator file. Inside of here, we made a couple constants so that if we ever change this value right here, that variable can stay the same. We made a couple action creators, which are functions that return objects. We're going to use these action creators a little bit later when our components dispatch actions. What I encourage you to do is take a look through some of this code and try to get this far yourself. Code along, understand what this code is doing, and just let us know if you have any questions. In the next video, we're going to start grabbing state from our Redux store and putting it into our React components. The only way we could possibly do that is first making sure we've installed React Redux, we have our provider component, and finally, that we're connecting our individual components to the Redux store. So in the next screencast, we'll start adding that functionality. I'll see you there.